My name is Estelle Mauldin. I'm 34 years old, and the day my mother toasted my sacrifice, I was supposed to be in a chemo chair. Instead, I was standing at the back of the Roswell Country Inn banquet room, holding a warm glass of sparkling cider, watching my mother lift her flute toward 200 people and tell them what a generous soul I was. The clinic on North Main had called my phone 4 minutes earlier. I felt it buzz against my hip while she talked. I let it go to voicemail. I already knew what it said. I had missed my last infusion, and the money that was supposed to pay for it was paying for the chicken or beef the waiters were setting down in front of all those folding chair smiles. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I set my glass on a tray and folded my hands. But here is the thing none of them knew, and it is the reason I can tell you this story at all. By the end of this, the house they bragged about will answer to me, and not one of them will see it coming, because the proof had been sitting in a candy tin for 20 years. You'll want to remember 3 things from that room, because they all come back. A green Sucrit's tin I hadn't opened yet. A woman from the bank named Marguerite who would soon tell me I already had the only signature that matters. And a letter I'd thrown in a drawer with a name on it I didn't recognize. The Estelle Mauldin Family Trust. I ignored it for a year. It was the loudest quiet thing I have ever owned. But this story really starts a long way before that toast. It starts at a kitchen table on West Matthew Street in a low brick house near the old Cahoon Park ditch, where the swamp cooler dripped rust down the sidewall every July and nobody ever fixed it. I was the cheap one. I want you to understand, I'm not guessing at that. I heard it. I was 9 years old in the hallway in my socks, and my mother was on the phone with her sister, and she said it plain. Estelle? Oh, Estelle's the cheap one. That child doesn't need a thing. She said it the way you'd describe a reliable car. No malice in it. That was the worst part. It wasn't an insult to her. It was just a fact she'd settled on. And once she settled on it, she spent the next 25 years collecting evidence to prove herself right. So I helped her. That's the part I'm not proud of. I became exactly what she filed me under. I didn't ask for new shoes. I packed my own lunches. When my sister Carla wanted ballet, then horseback, then a quinceañera that cost more than a used truck, I learned to want nothing out loud, because wanting was expensive, and I was the one we couldn't afford to spend on. Carla was the warm one, the pretty one, the one my father, Lee, would actually look up from the TV for. If you've ever been the kid in a family who got praised for needing less, you already know it isn't praise. It's a bill they're handing you early, and they expect you to pay it for the rest of your life. The one person in that house who saw me was my grandfather, Estelle Mauldin. Asa was a ditch writer for the irrigation district for 31 years. That means he walked the canals before sunup and decided whose fields got water and when. And he did it with a little brown notebook and a stub of pencil he sharpened with a pocket knife. He was the most patient man I ever met. He didn't talk much. He kept books. And on Sunday afternoons, while Carla was off being adored somewhere, Asa would set me up at his kitchen table with a ledger and a coffee can full of receipts, and he'd teach me to make the numbers tell the truth. People lie, Stell, he told me once. I couldn't have been more than 10. Numbers don't. You write it down the day it happens, you sign it, you keep the paper, and 20 years from now you'll still have the truth and they'll just have a story. He tapped the ledger. Whoever keeps the books keeps the power. Folks forget that. They think it's the loud one. He almost smiled. It's never the loud one. I thought he was just teaching me arithmetic. I know better now. Asa died 8 years ago, quiet in his sleep, the way patient men seem to get to go. At the funeral, my mother cried the prettiest, and my father gave a little speech about what a hard worker his daddy had been. And afterward, they sold off his tools and his truck and split what little cash there was, and they handed me a dented green Sucrit's tin, the breath lozenge kind with masking tape across the lid. On the tape, in Asa's blocky pencil capitals, it said, "For the quiet one." My mother handed it to me with 2 fingers like it might be sticky. "He wanted you to have his junk drawer, I guess," she said. Carla laughed. I took it home and I set it on my dresser and, God help me, I never opened it. The lid was rusted shut. And I told myself I'd get to it, and then a year went by, and then another, and you know how a thing on a dresser becomes invisible. It just becomes part of the wall. Here's what I built in those years, because it matters that you see I was fine before they came for me. I had a one-bedroom rental over on Garden Avenue. I did the books for 3 small businesses around town, a feed store, a dental office, and a man who poured concrete. And I did them well enough that they'd been with me for years and sent me Christmas cards. I kept my own accounts the way Asa taught me. Every receipt, every page signed and dated. My mother called it a sickness. At Thanksgiving, she'd tell the table, "Estelle's the calculator with no life," and everyone would chuckle, and I'd pass the rolls. The habit they laughed at was the only thing I owned that was completely, airtightly mine. Remember that. Then, 2 years ago, I got sick. I'm going to keep this part soft because you don't need the medical details, and I don't much like saying them out loud. It was the kind of sick that comes with a treatment plan on a clipboard and a number of sessions, and a chair you sit in for hours with a needle in your arm and a blanket they keep in a warmer by the door. I'm telling you about the chair because the chair is the whole story. There's a waiting room outside it with vinyl seats, and other people's families sit in those seats. They bring magazines and bad coffee and they wait. In 2 years of that chair, you want to know who sat in that waiting room for me? Nobody. Not my mother, not my father, not Carla. I drove myself every time, and I drove myself home, and I learned which gas station between the clinic and my apartment had a clean bathroom for when the nausea hit. I had set money aside for all of it. I'm a bookkeeper. Of course I had. I had opened a dedicated account at Pioneer Federal on Main, the branch where the whole town banks, where the manager, Marguerite Salinas, had known my grandfather and always called me honey and always remembered I took my deposit slip without the pen. I'd been feeding that account for years before I ever got sick, a little every month, the way Asa fed a ledger. By the time I needed it, it was enough, $40-some thousand, enough to finish the treatment and breathe. I'd made one mistake. Years back, when I first opened it, my mother had stood beside me at the counter and said it only made sense to put her name on it too, in case anything ever happened to me, in case I was, too sick to handle it. And I was 30 and healthy, and I trusted my own mother, so I said okay. I said okay the way I'd been saying okay my whole life. Joint account. Her name right next to mine. You can probably see the cliff from here. I didn't. That's the thing about being the cheap one. You spend so long proving you need nothing that you forget to guard the one thing you've got. Around the same time I got sick, Carla got engaged. Not to anybody you'd remember. A nice enough fellow named Travis who sold farm insurance. But the wedding. Oh, the wedding. My mother had been waiting her entire life for that wedding. The Golden Daughter, the church on Pennsylvania Avenue, the reception at the Country Inn, 200 guests, a sit-down dinner, a dress with a train. Vondra Mauldin was going to throw the wedding this town would talk about, and she was going to do it whether the money existed or not. It did not exist. I know that now, the way I know everything now, on paper. The house on West Matthews had a second mortgage on it that I'd never heard about. There was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC maxed nearly to the dollar, and most of what was drawn on it had Carla's name written all over the spending. My parents were underwater and sinking and absolutely terrified, not of losing the house, but of the town finding out. In Roswell, the wedding has to be big, because a small wedding for the favorite daughter would tell every neighbor on the street exactly what shape the Mauldins were really in. My mother would rather burn the house down with all of us in it than let the church ladies see her pour cheap wine. So she went looking for money, and there it was, a Pioneer Federal account with $40-some thousand in it, and conveniently her name right there on the second line. I found out the way you always find out these things, which is by accident and too late. I'd gone in to schedule my last few sessions, the home stretch, the end of 2 years of that chair, and the scheduler said the clinic hadn't been able to confirm my payment method. I said that was strange. The account was funded, and I drove straight to the branch on Main to sort it out, irritated, thinking it was a bank error. Marguerite Salinas was at her desk. She looked up at me and her face did a thing I'll never forget. It folded. She knew before I did. "Honey," she said, real soft, and she turned her monitor a few inches toward me, which I don't think she was strictly allowed to do. "Sit down a minute." The account had $411 in it. Over the previous 3 months, in transfers of $9,000 here and $12,000 there, the money had moved out. $41,200 gone into another account, and I knew the other account because I'd helped my mother open it back when she said she wanted somewhere to keep the wedding funds separate. Every transfer was authorized by the joint account holder, Estelle Mauldin. My mother had spent my treatment on Carla's reception, dollar for dollar, and she had done it slow and quiet over a season, the way you'd bleed a radiator, so I wouldn't notice the pressure dropping until the engine seized. I sat in that vinyl chair across from Marguerite, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I asked her to print it. All of it. The dates, the amounts, the destination account. She hesitated, then she printed it, and she slid it across the desk, and she put her hand flat on top of the page for a second before she let go. "I've been watching this account for a while," she said quietly. "Long before this. Some things didn't sit right with me, going back years. She wasn't quite looking at me. Your grandfather banked here too, you know. Asa." She said his name like it meant something she wasn't ready to explain. "Honey, I'm going to tell you one thing, and then I'm going to let you go think. You'll figure the rest. You always could." She tapped the printout. "You already have the only signature that matters." I didn't understand her. I thought it was just something kind people say. I folded the printout into quarters. I drove home. I did not cry, which surprised me, and I sat down at my own kitchen table with my own ledgers, and I started out of pure habit to write down what had happened. The date, the amount, 41,200, the name. And while I was reaching for the pen, my eyes went up to the dresser through the bedroom door, and they landed, for the first time in 8 years, on a dented green tin with masking tape across the lid. For the quiet one. I went and I got it. The lid had rusted itself shut. I worked a butter knife around the rim, and it gave all at once with a little gasp of old metal, and I looked inside, and what was in there changed everything. My name is Estelle Mauldin, and what was in that tin was not junk. On top there was a brass key, not a house key, not a car key. Flat and stubby with a number stamped into the head of it, 1147, and a little hole drilled through the end where you'd thread a ring. I knew that kind of key. Anybody who's ever done a person's books knows that kind of key. It's a safe deposit box key, and the number on it is the box. I turned it over in my fingers, and the brass had gone soft and dull with age. And on the masking tape wrapped around the bow of it, in that same blocky pencil, Asa had written, "Pioneer." Just that, Pioneer. Under the key there was a folded paper, not new. The folds had gone soft and furred the way paper does when it's been folded the same way for years and never opened. I worked it apart on the kitchen table under the light, careful the way you'd open something that might tear, and at the top in a lawyer's typeface it said, "The Asa Mauldin Family Trust," and under that, Declaration of Trust and a date 20 years gone. I want to tell you I understood it right then. I didn't. I read it 3 times and the words kept sliding off me because the thing your eyes are looking for and the thing on the page were too far apart for my brain to put them in the same room. But I'd seen enough legal paper across enough business desks to catch the shape of it, and the shape of it was this. My grandfather, 20 years before, had taken a thing and put it inside this trust, the way you'd put a thing inside a box, so that the box owned it and not the people standing around it. And the trust had a trustee, the person who runs the box, and it had a successor trustee, the person who runs the box after, and there, on the second page, typed clean, was the successor trustee, Estelle Marie Mauldin, me, not Lee, not Vondra, not Carla, the warm one, the pretty one, the one they'd have handed the moon to, me, the cheap one, the one you don't spend on. My grandfather had reached forward 20 years through a soft folded piece of paper and put his hand flat on my shoulder, and I sat at my kitchen table on Garden Avenue with a butter knife still in my fist, and I did the math on what that meant, and I could not make it come out small. But I didn't know yet what was in the box. The trust certificate names a trust. It doesn't tell you what's inside it. For that, I needed box 1147, and for box 1147, I needed to walk back into Pioneer Federal on Main, and that I could not do until morning. I did not sleep. I sat up with Asa's old ledgers, the ones I'd kept after the funeral when they sold off everything else, and I read his handwriting until the sky over Roswell went from black to the dirty pink it goes when the sun comes up over the plains east of town. And I thought about a Sunday 30 years back, a 10-year-old at his elbow and his voice. Whoever keeps the books keeps the power. It's never the loud one. I was at the branch before they unlocked the door. Marguerite Salinas saw the key in my hand before I said a word. I set it on her desk, that dull brass with Pioneer on the tape, and she looked at it, and she looked at me, and something behind her face that had been holding very still for a long time let go all at once. She didn't act surprised. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She didn't act surprised at all. "You found it," she said. "You knew about this." She folded her hands the way I fold mine. "Honey," she said, "your grandfather sat at that desk right there, the one by the window, 20 years ago, with a young lawyer from over on Richardson Avenue, and he set this up, and he made me a witness to one of the signatures. I was a teller then. I've watched this branch a long time." She stood. "I'm not allowed to tell you what's in your own box, but I can take you to it." The vault was cold and quiet the way those rooms are. She put the bank's key in one lock and turned it, and she stepped back, the way they do, and she let me put 1147 in the other, and I turned it, and the long drawer slid out into my two hands heavier than I expected, and I carried it to the little curtained booth, and I sat down, and I opened the lid. There was not money in it. I think part of me had hoped, the small starved animal part, that there'd be cash. The 41,000 back, a clean fix. There was no cash. There was paper, and the paper was worth 1,000 times more than cash, and it took me an hour in that cold little booth to understand why. There was a deed, a warranty deed to the low brick house on West Matthews Street, the house I grew up cheap in, the house with the swamp cooler that dripped rust every July. And the deed did not say Lee Mauldin and Vondra Mauldin. The deed said Grantee, the Asa Mauldin Family Trust, dated 20 years back, recorded, stamped, filed with the county. My grandfather had bought that house, or taken it over when my parents couldn't carry it. I'd learn the why of that later, and he had never, not for one day, put it in my parents' names. He had put it in the box. He had let them live in it, raise us in it, host their dinners and their pride in it. For 20 years, and the whole time the house did not belong to them. It belonged to the trust. And after Asa, the trust belonged to its successor trustee. It belonged to me. I sat in that booth and I held the deed in two hands, and I thought about my mother saying, "Estelle's the cheap one. That child doesn't need a thing." And I started quietly to laugh, and then I stopped myself because the laugh had something else underneath it that I didn't want to do in a bank. But there was one more thing in the box, and it's the thing that turned a windfall into a story. The thing that told me my grandfather hadn't just been protecting an asset. He'd been watching a family. Folded under the deed was a single sheet in his own pencil hand, a list, and it was a list of names with amounts beside them and little dates, the way he'd keep any ledger. And most of the names I knew, the feed store, the county, numbers I could place. But near the bottom, there was a name I had never in my life heard, with a small amount paid out beside it every month going back years and years. A woman's name, Odessa Pruitt. I'd never heard it. Not at a single Thanksgiving, not at the funeral, not once. And my grandfather had been quietly sending this Odessa Pruitt money every month for the better part of 2 decades. And beside her name, in the same blocky capitals as the tin, he'd written 4 words, "See that she's kept." Who else had he been shielding? And why that name? a name his own family had never been allowed to hear. I copied the name onto the back of my hand with the pen Marguerite always remembered I forgot to take. I put the deed and the trust and the list back in the drawer because that drawer was the safest place in Roswell, and I knew it now, and I kept only the key. And I went to find Odessa Pruitt because Asa had taught me you don't trust a number until you've matched it to the thing it stands for. She was not hard to find. In a town this size, nobody is. She lived out past the old Cahoon Park ditch in a tidy little place with a ramp built up to the front door. And she was a woman in her 70s now with steady hands and a steadier look. And when I said my name was Estelle Mauldin, Asa's granddaughter, she put one of those steady hands flat against the doorframe and her eyes went wet, and she said, "The quiet one. He told me about you." Odessa Pruitt had been a home health aide. Years back, when my grandfather's knees and then his heart started to go, before any of us had thought to notice, it was Odessa who'd come to the West Matthews house 3 mornings a week, and it was Odessa, not Vondra, not Lee, who'd sat with him. And when her own troubles came, when the work dried up and her husband passed and the medical bills came for her the way they'd later come for me, Asa had quietly, every month, seen that she was kept. No fanfare, no table speech, just a number in a ledger and 4 words. She sat me down at her own kitchen table, and she poured coffee I didn't drink. And she told me things about my own family I had never been allowed to know. "Your granddaddy saw everything," she said. "People thought he was just a quiet old man walking the ditches. But honey, he kept books on the heart, same as the water. He saw how they did you." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "He told me one time," he said, "Odessa, that little girl Estelle, she's the only one of them who writes it down. The rest of them just spend." He said, "When I'm gone, the spenders are going to spend right off the edge of a cliff. And when they do, the one who wrote it all down is going to be the only one holding the rope." She looked at me steady. "He didn't set that trust up to be cruel. He set it up because he knew the day was coming when you'd need it, and he wasn't going to be here to hand it to you himself. So he hid it where they'd never think to look. He hid it in the one thing they didn't value." She almost smiled the way he used to. He hid it with the quiet one. And then Odessa Pruitt told me the last piece, the one that snapped the whole thing shut like a butter knife giving way on a rusted lid. She told me about the neighbor. 2 doors down from the house on West Matthews, there'd been a family, the Calderas, good people, who'd nearly lost their place to foreclosure years back. And it was Asa, quiet, behind the scenes, who'd helped them hold on, who'd sat with the husband and shown him how the bank's paper worked and what to sign and what never to sign. Odessa had watched him do it. He knew that bank inside and out, she said. He knew what a mortgage was and what it wasn't. He knew you can't borrow against a thing you don't own. She set her cup down. Now, why do you suppose a man would make so sure, so careful, that his own children never owned the house they lived in? A man that kind? I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. Because sitting in Odessa Pruitt's kitchen with my grandfather's name on every wall of the story, I had finally done the math, all of it, the whole 20 years of it, and it came out the way Asa's numbers always came out. Exact. True. Unanswerable. My parents had a second mortgage on the house on West Matthews. They had a line of credit, a HELOC drawn down to nearly the last dollar, and they'd poured it into a church on Pennsylvania Avenue and a reception at the Country Inn, and a dress with a train. They had borrowed twice against a house, and the house was not theirs. The house had never, for one single day in 20 years, been theirs to borrow against. You can't pledge what you don't own. Every signature they'd put on that bank's paper was a signature on a thing they had no right to sign for. And the person who did have the right, the only signature that matters, the successor trustee of the Asa Mauldin Family Trust, was driving home across Roswell that afternoon with a woman's blessing on her shoulders and a brass key in her pocket and a parking stub from a chemo appointment she never got to use, folded in her coat. doing the quiet arithmetic of exactly how and exactly when she was going to let them find out. The afternoon I drove home from Odessa Pruitt's place, I did not go fast and I did not go slow. I drove the speed you drive when the thing you're carrying is heavier than the car. I went up Main and past the Pioneer Federal Branch with its flat tan brick, and I slowed without meaning to, the way you slow past a church you used to belong to. And then I went on home to Garden Avenue and I sat down at my own kitchen table and I did what my grandfather taught me to do with a thing too big to hold. I broke it into rows. I got a clean legal pad. At the top, I wrote the date, June of that year, the way I write the date on everything, because Asa taught me a number with no date on it is just a rumor. And then I started building the only document that has ever mattered in my whole quiet life, which was a single page that put every other page in order. Row 1, the parking stub. I took it out of my coat pocket where it had been riding for 11 days, folded soft now, a flimsy gray ticket from the lot behind the oncology center, with the date stamped in faded dot matrix ink, and a time. The time of an appointment I never sat down for. I'd kept it the way I keep everything, on reflex, the habit they laughed at, the calculator with no life. I smoothed it flat on the table and I looked at that date for a long time, because 2 doors down the hall from that lot on that exact date was a chair with my name on a clipboard taped to the arm of it. The last chair, the final one, the one the nurse with the kind voice had called my account 3 times to confirm. And on that same date, 40 miles of nothing later, my mother had stood up at the country inn with a glass of something pale in her hand and told a banquet room full of Roswell that her daughter Estelle understood that family means sacrifice. Row 2, the transfer. I laid Marguerite's printout beside the stub, the one she'd slid across her desk with her hand flat on top of it. $41,200 moved out of the account I had labeled in my own books. Medical reserved do not touch, in 3 withdrawals across 2 weeks, every one of them landing in an account I now knew funded a church on Pennsylvania Avenue, a reception hall, and a dress with a train long enough to need 2 girls to carry it. My money, my finish line, spent on a beginning that wasn't mine. Row 3, the key. I set the brass key on the legal pad with Pioneer on the tape, and I didn't write anything next to it because there's nothing you can write next to a thing like that. It just sat there and weighed what it weighed. Row 4, the trust. I didn't take the trust certificate out of box 1147 because that box was the safest place in the county, and I decided it would stay that way. But I'd had Marguerite make me a certified copy, stamped, with the bank's seal pressed into the corner, and I'd had her notarize my own page, the page with my name on it, Estelle Mauldin, successor trustee, the page that said the low brick house on West Matthews Street belonged to the Asa Mauldin Family Trust and had belonged to it, unbroken, for 20 years. And then there was row 5, and row 5 was the one I couldn't write myself. Row 5 was a letter, and only one person in Roswell could put her name at the bottom of it. I went back to the branch the next morning. Marguerite Salinas was at her desk by the window, the same desk, and I sat down across from her, and I laid out my legal pad, and I walked her through the rows the way I'd walk a client through a year of books, quiet in order, no voice raised. She listened the whole way through with her hands folded and her chin down, and when I got to the end, to the thing I needed from her, she didn't say no, and she didn't say yes. She got up and she closed the door of her little glass office, which she had never once done in all the times I'd sat there, and she came back and she sat down and she said, "I've been waiting 8 years to be asked the right question." I asked her the right question. I asked her to pull the lien history on the property at West Matthews Street. Every recorded encumbrance, every signature, every date. She already had it. That's the thing. She slid open a drawer and took out a folder that was not new, a folder she had been keeping, and she laid it open and turned it to face me. And there it was, in the bank's own records, the whole quiet arithmetic of how a family spends itself off a cliff. A second mortgage on the house, taken 11 years back, signed Lee Mauldin and Vondra Mauldin. A home equity line opened 4 years back, drawn down to nearly the last dollar this past spring, signed Lee Mauldin and Vondra Mauldin. Every one of those signatures sitting on top of a property that the same bank's deed records, 2 file drawers over, said had been owned the entire time by the Asa Mauldin Family Trust. Marguerite put one finger on the second mortgage. When this came across years ago, before I was manager, before I could do anything about it, I flagged it, she said. I wrote a note. I have the note. It says the grantor of record doesn't match the borrowers, and it got buried, the way things get buried, because your parents are pleasant people who pay their minimums, and nobody wanted to open a thing that big. She looked up at me, but it never went away. A thing like this doesn't go away. It just waits for somebody who keeps their books to come stand in front of it. She closed the folder. Honey, she said, you already have the only signature that matters. You've had it for 20 years. You just didn't know your grandfather put it in your hand. I asked her to write the letter, a plain letter on Pioneer Federal letterhead, stating the facts as the bank's own records held them, that the property securing the Mauldin second mortgage and home equity line was titled to a trust, that the borrowers of record were not the owners of record, and that the successor trustee, identified, had standing to govern the trust's property. She wrote it. She printed it. She signed it. Marguerite Salinas, branch manager, and she pressed the seal into the corner and she slid it across the desk and put her hand flat on top of it for a second before she let go, the same way she had the first time. And I understood now that the gesture wasn't hesitation. It was a blessing. It was a woman handing you a thing she'd guarded a long time and asking you to carry it well. I drove home with 5 rows in a folder on the passenger seat where a person should have been. Now here is what I want you to understand about me, because if you don't understand this, you'll think the next part was easy, and it was the hardest quiet thing I have ever done. I did not want a scene. I have spent 34 years not wanting a scene. I am the daughter who folds her hands, who never interrupts, who lets the loud ones be loud because the loud ones need it, and I never thought I did. My grandfather told me once, at his kitchen table with the ledgers open between us, that the loud ones spend the room and the quiet one keeps the receipt, and I had built my whole self on the second half of that sentence. I was not going to stand up at a banquet table and raise a glass. That was hers. That was my mother's instrument, and she could keep it. So I called a family meeting, not at the church, not at a restaurant where she could perform for a waiter. I called it at the house on West Matthews Street, in the front room with the swamp cooler dripping its rust streak down the outside brick, at the round oak table that had been my grandfather's before it was theirs, the table I'd learned to add columns on when I was 9 years old and small enough that my feet didn't reach the floor. They came because I never asked for anything. And a person who never asks for anything, when she finally asks, makes the askers nervous. Carla came in her going-out clothes, sun-warm and pretty and already a little bored. The bride, 2 winters married now and the shine of it gone gray around the edges, in a way nobody at this table would say out loud. My father, Lee, came in his good shirt, the one he wears when he expects to nod along to something. And my mother, Vondra, came last, the way she always comes last, so the room is already assembled to receive her, and she sat down at the head of the table without anyone deciding she should, because she always sits at the head, and no one had ever once told her the table wasn't hers. She looked at the folder in front of me and she smiled, the smile she smiles. Well, she said, look at you with your little paperwork. Did somebody finally make our Estelle do a budget for the family? She said it warm. That's the thing about my mother you have to understand for any of this to land. She is not a cold woman. She is a warm woman who has decided all the way down that I am a resource and that her warmth is the interest she pays on me. She believes sincerely in her own heart that I owe this family my body and my savings and my silence, and that her loving me is the receipt for the debt. Sacrifice is love in my mother's books, and she had been spending my love for 34 years and calling every withdrawal a gift. "I want to thank you all for coming," I said, and my voice came out exactly the way it always comes out, low, even, folded. I saw my mother relax. She heard the quiet and she read it the way she'd read it her whole life, as weakness, as the cheap one being agreeable, and she settled back in my grandfather's chair to enjoy whatever small thing I'd called them here to say. "I'm going to show you some things," I said. "In order. I'm not going to raise my voice. You know I never do." I opened the folder. I took out the parking stub first because Asa taught me you start with the smallest true thing and you let it grow. I smoothed it flat on the oak in front of my mother, gray and soft and faded, and I said, "Do you know what this is?" Nobody answered. "It's a parking ticket from the lot behind the cancer center. It has a date on it." I touched the date with one finger the way Marguerite had touched the lien. On this date, I had an appointment. The last one. The one that finishes the course. "I want you to read the date out loud, Mama." She didn't. Her smile held, but it had stopped meaning anything, the way a clock keeps its hands when the works have gone quiet inside. "You don't have to," I said. "I'll tell you what else happened on that date. On this date, you stood up at the country inn and you raised a glass, and you told a room full of people that I understand that family means sacrifice." I let that sit on the table next to the stub. You were right. I do understand it. I understand it better than anyone at this table. I just want all of us to be clear about who was doing the sacrificing and who was raising the glass. Then I took out the second row, the transfer. $41,200 on Pioneer Federal's own paper, the 3 withdrawals, the dates, the destination, laid down in a neat column beside the stub. My father made a sound in his throat and reached for it, and I did not stop him, because Asa taught me you let them touch the proof, you let them hold it. It makes it real in a way no shouting ever does. "That's the medical account," I said. "The one I labeled in my own books, the books you all think are so funny. Reserved. Do not touch." I looked at my mother, and she looked back at me. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched something move behind her eyes that I had never once seen there, which was the very beginning of the understanding that the quiet one had been keeping count. "Now," I said, and I reached into the folder for the 3rd row, for a dull brass key with a number stamped into the head of it and a strip of old masking tape on the bow. "I want to tell you about a candy tin. I want to tell you about a candy tin. When I was a girl, my grandfather Asa kept his cough drops in a little green tin, a sucretes tin, the kind with the lid that you have to pry with your thumbnail because the paint has gummed it shut. He kept it on the windowsill above his kitchen sink, here in this house, before it was your house, when the ditch out back still ran full in June and you could hear the water move at night. He'd pop the lid and offer me one, and I never wanted one. They tasted like medicine, but I'd take it anyway because taking the thing he offered was how you sat with Asa. He died 8 years ago. You all remember the day. Mama, you cried at the service, and then you went through his closet that same afternoon looking for the good watch. And when there wasn't a good watch, you said he never had 2 nickels to rub together. The old ditch rider. And that was the end of him in this family's mouth. The poor relation, the man who saved string. You divided up what little there was and you forgot him, and you moved into his house on West Matthews like it had fallen out of the sky for you. I kept the tin. Nobody fought me for it. Why would they? It was a dented green box that rattled, and when Carla saw me take it off the windowsill, she laughed and said, "Leave it to Estelle to inherit the junk drawer." I took it home to Garden Avenue and I put it on my own windowsill, and for 8 years I did not open it, because the lid was rusted shut, and because some part of me, the soft part I don't show you, didn't want to use up the last thing he'd touched. I thought it was cough drops. I thought it was a girl's keepsake. I was wrong about what was in it the way you are all about to learn you were wrong about everything. The night Marguerite first said her sentence to me, the one about the only signature that mattered, I went home and I took the tin down and I sat at my table with it, and I worked the lid with the edge of a butter knife, the way you'd open a paint can, slow, prying until the rust gave with a sound like a small breath. And I want you to understand, on the inside of the lid, in my grandfather's square pencil handwriting, the handwriting I'd watched add columns my whole childhood, it said 4 words. For the quiet one. That's what he called me, not the cheap one, the quiet one. I reached into the folder and I set the tin on the oak table in front of my mother, dented side up, and I pried the lid for them so they could hear it, that little breath of rust. And inside there were 2 things, a brass key with a number stamped in the head and a strip of masking tape on the bow that said Pioneer, and a folded square of heavy paper gone soft at the creases, the kind of paper you only see on a thing that was meant to last longer than the person who signed it. My father said, "What is that?" I unfolded it on the table where they all could see, slow, smoothing each crease flat with the side of my hand, the way I smooth everything, and I turned it so it faced my mother right side up, because Asa taught me you never make a person read a document upside down, you hand it to them the way the truth would hand it to them. It was a certificate. At the top it said the Estelle Mauldin Family Trust, and under that, in the dense gray print of a thing drawn up by a lawyer 20 years ago, it said that the real property at West Matthews Street, this house, this room, this table, the swamp cooler dripping its rust streak down the brick outside that window, had been conveyed into that trust 2 decades back, and that the trustee of record, the owner, the only owner, had never once been Lee Mauldin and had never once been Vondra Mauldin. It had been Asa, and on his passing, by the plain language of the page, it passed to the successor he named, me. My mother read it. I watched her read it twice. I watched the warmth drain out of her face the way water leaves a tub, slow and then all at once, and I watched her reach for the thing she always reaches for, the smile, the warm wave of the hand, the "it's all a misunderstanding," and I watched it not come, because there's nothing warm to say to a stamped page. "This is nothing," she said finally, but her voice had gone thin. "This is some old paper. You can't just... This is our house. We've lived here 20 years. You pay the mortgage," I said. "Yes. Let's talk about the mortgage." I took out the last 2 rows. I laid down the lean history Marguerite had kept in her drawer for years, the folder that wasn't new, and I walked my finger down it the way she'd walked her finger down it for me. 11 years ago, you took a second mortgage on this house, both your signatures. 4 years ago, you opened a home equity line, both your signatures. And this past spring, you drew that line down to almost nothing, and you put it into a church on Pennsylvania Avenue, and the country inn, an address with a train. I looked at Carla when I said the dress, not to wound her, just so she'd know I knew, and she had gone very still in her going-out clothes. 41,000 of it came out of an account that was mine. The rest came out of the bank. And here is the part I need all 3 of you to hear, because I'm only going to say it once, and I'm going to say it quiet. I put 1 finger on the trust certificate and 1 finger on the second mortgage, the way you'd hold 2 ends of a thing to show they don't meet. You didn't borrow against your house, I said. You borrowed against mine. The swamp cooler dripped. Somebody's water moved in the ditch out back, faint, the way it had the night he offered me a cough drop I didn't want. Nobody said anything for a long time, and into that quiet I laid the last page, Marguerite Salinas' letter on Pioneer Federal letterhead, the seal pressed into the corner, stating in the bank's own careful language that the property securing the Mauldin loans was titled to a trust, that the borrowers of record were not the owners of record, and that the successor trustee, named Estelle Marie Mauldin, had standing to govern the property. My father picked it up. His hands weren't steady. He's a man who has spent his whole life nodding along to my mother, and I watched him read a sentence he could not nod along to. And I felt something for him I had not planned to feel, which was a kind of tired pity, because he'd signed his name to a cliff and let her tell him it was a porch. "You'd put us out," my mother said. And there it was. Finally, the thing under all of it. The thing Asa must have seen at this table years before I understood it. Not anger, fear. The bare animal fear of a woman who had borrowed against a house to look like a success in a town where the pharmacist knows whose prescription went unfilled and who had just learned that the house was never hers to lie with. You'd put your own parents out on the street. After everything we did for you. No, I said. I wouldn't. And I watched that land harder than the page had. Because here is what I'd decided on the drive home from Odessa Pruitt's place, the home health aide my grandfather quietly paid for years. The second name I'd found listed in the trust and couldn't explain until I sat in her front room and she told me. She'd nursed a neighbor of his through a long illness, a woman with nobody, and Asa had covered it out of his own thin pocket and told no one. And he'd written Odessa into his trust as protected because, she said, a man who watches how a family treats the one who needs the least learns exactly who that family is. She told me he used to say I was the one he didn't worry about and the one he worried about most, both at once, because the quiet ones get eaten last and slowest. She told me he set the whole thing up the year my mother called me the cheap one at a Thanksgiving table. The year I was 9 and didn't know he'd heard. He'd heard. He went to a lawyer that winter. He'd been building me a floor to stand on for 20 years, and he let me think he was a man who saved string. So no, I wasn't going to do to them what they did to me. That's her instrument. I don't play it. What I did was procedural, and I did it the Monday after that meeting in Marguerite's glass office with the door closed. As successor trustee, I instructed Pioneer Federal to freeze the home equity line that Wedding had been drawn from. Effective immediately, no further draws. And because the bank's own records now showed loans signed against property the borrowers never held title to, Marguerite did the only thing her job left her to do, which she did without a flicker. She opened a file. The lender's fraud review of my parents' signatures began that week. The same buried flag she'd written years ago, surfacing at last with a trustee's name behind it, strong enough to make it move. They keep the house. I want to be clear about that, because the town tells it both ways. They keep the house on West Matthews. They live in it still, in the front room with the rust streak, at Asa's round oak table. They live there as tenants of the Estelle Mauldin Family Trust, on a lease I had drawn up at a rent set to the dollar, paid on the 1st, recorded in a ledger I keep. The daughter they called the cheap one sets the terms now and signs the receipts and files them by date. My mother has never once raised a glass to me again. She is very quiet at the 1st of the month. She has learned the price of quiet, which I could have told her 20 years ago, except no one at that table ever asked the quiet one anything. I never raised my voice. I want that on the record too. Not once in that front room did I do the thing she would have done. I folded my hands and I laid down pages in order, and I let 20 years of receipts say what I was never allowed to say out loud. There's a girl in this family you've never noticed. My cousin's child, 11 years old, the one who sits at the far end of every holiday table and clears the plates without being asked and never asks for seconds. The one they call shy, the one nobody worries about because she needs so little. I have been watching her the way I was watched. Last week I went to a lawyer on Main, 2 doors down from Pioneer Federal, and I had the trust amended. I named her successor beneficiary, the next quiet one, with a floor under her she won't find for years, and a woman in Marguerite's chair who'll know to keep her flags. Then I drove out to her mother's place, and I sat down at their kitchen table, and I slid a small thing across the wood to face her, right side up, the way the truth hands it to you. A fresh green tin, the lid not yet rusted. Inside, a key, and 4 words in pencil. The quiet ones keep the books.